Good afternoon. Lots of smiling faces here. Glad to see you here. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to the John Locke Foundation, where we are all about freedom and liberty and providing more opportunity for every single North Carolinian because we believe not only in our hearts, but based on research, that people thrive when they have more choices, and we know that it is freedom that around the world lifts people out of poverty. And that's why we work so hard, particularly when it comes to policies that are being made in the state legislature, to make sure that the folks who are making those decisions understand exactly the consequences behind the decisions that they will make and what it means for not only this generation, but succeeding generations of North Carolinians. We do everything we can to make sure that they have all of the data at their fingertips so that they make informed choices. I see a number of you here who are frequent visitors and some folks we haven't seen in a while, so glad to have you back. Hope that you will come more often. I also see a number of folks here with us who are investors in our work. Thank you so much, because as we say, we hope it doesn't get old when you hear this. We really could not do what we do without your financial support, so thank you very much. I have to say that Robert Shibley, our guest today, before we get started with just a couple announcements here, I love this in his biography, and it seems like a perfect day to bring this up. He says in his bio that Robert and his family live in the Research Triangle area, home to the Duke Blue Devils and several other lesser intercollegiate athletic teams. One of those, I guess, is playing tonight, I think, right? Okay, so do we have any predictions for tonight? There you go. Okay. So glad you're with us here on this beautiful Monday. A couple of quick announcements. Next week, we are very delighted. We're going to have a state legislator with us, and it's really hard to get those folks to come over when they're in session. We're delighted that Representative Jimmy Dixon out of the Duplin County area is going to be with us. He's going to be talking about farming and agriculture in North Carolina. He is a farmer. It's very close to his heart, his heritage, and the policy decisions that he makes. He's going to talk a little bit about the industry and what he has seen personally and in terms of policy. And then on April 17th, which will be what? Tax filing deadline day. Hope you've getting your paperwork together. Joe Henchman from the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C. is going to be down to join us, talk about the incredible tax reform that we have seen, historic reform that we have seen here in North Carolina over the last several years. Delighted to tell you, if you don't already know, that many of the reform ideas that have taken shape here in our state are based on John Locke Foundation ideas and principles. And we feel very honored and proud that we have helped legislators understand, once again, the ideas and the ramifications of the decisions that they make. So as you're filing your paperwork this year, know that each and every one of us is paying a lower personal income tax rate based on decisions made at the General Assembly over the past several years, again, based in our ideas. So we've got a jam-packed April. Hope you can come to every one of these events. It's really going to be an interesting month. All right, about a month ago, you probably, if you had never heard of this college, Middlebury pretty much came onto your radar screen, right? Pretty amazing things going on there when Charles Murray was not allowed to speak. And I want to read you something from a Washington Post piece real quick here that was written by our guest today, Mr. Shibley, who is the executive director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, also known as FIRE. He wrote, "Free speech on campus is facing a profound threat, not at the hands of President Trump, nor even at the hands of the administrators and lawyers who've done so much to erode academia's respect for freedom of expression. No, as highlighted by the violent disruption and end of Charles Murray's visit to Middlebury College in Vermont, the immediate crisis comes from one of freedom's most ancient enemies, the angry mob." And I just thought that this was such a fascinating subject about what's going on here on college campuses around the country. We've actually seen it in North Carolina over the past several years as well. That's why we invited Robert to be with us. By the way, he is a board member of the Martin Center for Academic Renewal, which is one of the organizations that we are very much friends with here in our state. He's a graduate of Duke, hence what he said about those lesser known teams. He also holds a law degree from the Duke University of Law School. He is the executive director of FIRE, and he's the author of the book Twisting Title IX from Encounter Books, and hopefully he'll talk to us a little bit about that as well. So please welcome Robert Shibley. I'll let you put that on.
All right, great, thank you. All right, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate that, and it is good to be here. I want to talk to you today, as Donna said, about a speech that I wouldn't have given in my first probably 10 or so years at FIRE, and that has to do with campus violence and the free speech debate on campuses. I want to sort of take you through the status of the legal status of free speech on campus, and especially with an emphasis here in North Carolina, and then also talk to you about some of the incidents we've been seeing lately and some of the proposed solutions that people have proposed, why I don't think those will work, and hopefully have a good discussion towards the end. FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We defend free speech on college and university campuses, as well as freedom of religion, freedom of association and expression, and due process. And we've got our mission up there. We were founded in 1999, so we are coming up soon on 20 years here, which is always a sort of a bit of a reason for us to lament at FIRE. Our founders thought this would only be a 10-year-long battle that we would have to fight. So to a certain extent, I wish I weren't here. We've all been trying to work ourselves out of a job and have so far totally failed at that. As you can see, it's not for lack of trying. We've had a lot of victories. Last year alone, we had 19 victories on college campuses. We've had 238 over the years, and that affected 2.7 million students, and that is only accelerating. That number of victories and that number of students being affected by us. We actually just last week launched a whole new litigation project called the Million Voices Project, where for the first time FIRE is actually going to start acting as co-counsel, which is a big step for us, but we are actually going to be one of the law firms effectively working on free speech issues. And that's all so that we can work more efficiently and bring more of these suits and hopefully liberate more students' expression. A little bit on the way speech codes, the situation we have right now on college campuses. It's actually improved a lot over the last few years. We talk about, to have some clarity in terminology, what we call a speech code is any university regulation or policy that prohibits expression that would be protected by the First Amendment in society at large. That's sort of the common denominator when we're saying, what makes this a speech code as opposed to a set of rules about speech that are actually legitimate, and that's what we've used. Public universities don't have a choice but to obey the First Amendment, although most of them, unfortunately, do make the choice not to obey the First Amendment, and private universities have to live up to their own promises of freedom of speech. One of the interesting things that we've found in our research over the years, and we've been doing this since 2006, rating these schools, and I'll get to that in a minute, is despite the fact that public universities are obliged to follow the First Amendment, the percentage of public and private universities that have speech codes really is not very different. It moves almost together. And I think that's sort of a testament to the amount of leeway that universities sort of uniquely have as government agencies in the United States, that they can, basically treat themselves the same way a private entity does. This is a wall of text, so I apologize for that, but I just wanted to get that up there and explain what we mean by red, yellow, and green light. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. A red light institution has at least one what we call laughably unconstitutional speech code. That's a speech code that doesn't pass First Amendment lawyers' laugh test. A yellow light institution is one that has codes that can too easily be abused in order to censor speech on campus, and a green light school is one that doesn't have either of those things. That doesn't mean that they're not going to censor speech on campus. It just means that we can't find any rules, and we're very good at finding them. We can't find any rules that are easily either abused or obviously contravene free speech. Here's a little infographic. This is as of last year, or as of this current year, 449 schools that we rate. And yeah, that means we read the student handbooks of 449 schools, and we do it every year. 178 received a red light rating, 237 got yellow, and 27 got a green light rating. So that's about 40% red. It's about 5 or 6% green, and the rest yellow. That's actually a really big improvement. The first year we did this, we didn't have 400 schools, but we had about 350. We go up a little bit every year. There was 80% red. So we're down to 40% red, and it's dropped 10% in the last year. Most of those have gone to the yellow category. And you can see we're sort of like saying, yay, the number of green light institutions has more than tripled, but it started at 8. So that's not, saying very much, unfortunately. North Carolina, how do they stack up here? Here's a little infographic that my assistant, who's not from North Carolina, made. So if he got any locations of schools wrong, please blame him and not me, but I thought it looked pretty good overall. You can see the 2 greens in there, which are highlighted at the bottom, Duke and UNC, still keeping it neck and neck. At the bottom are the 2 green light schools in North Carolina. The 2 red lights are Davidson and the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And the rest are all yellow light schools. And I just spoke at Appalachian State on Wednesday, and hopefully we will, I had a really good conversation with some of the folks there, and I think they're interested in getting on the green light list. But what this means is that any of these schools are subject to potentially a lawsuit from us or somebody else if they use these rules to censor someone on campus, which they do. It happens, and FIRE's first impulse is not to sue. Our first impulse is to, we say, hey, you guys did this, you need to fix it. And we've done that several times with several of these schools, NC State being one that leaps to mind more recently, as well as Appalachian State. But North Carolina's got work to do. That said, because we have so few red light schools, North Carolina is one of the best states in the union when it comes to free speech on campus. So now I turn to this disturbing trend of campus violence, and this is the part of the speech that is new for me, and that I'm really disappointed it's become an issue here. This is the guy who, in many ways, I think you could say he kicked this off. This guy is Richard Spencer. He is probably the most famous openly identifying white nationalist in America. He's president of this group called the National Policy Institute, and he advocates for what he calls a, quote, peaceful ethnic cleansing and the creation of a white ethno-state on the North American continent. And if you've heard about the alt-right, supposedly, and you never know, this is supposedly the guy who came up with the term. He coined the term. It's difficult to think of somebody more controversial than this person, or at least somebody with beliefs more controversial, who you might actually run into that wasn't wearing a hood or something along those lines. And back in December, he was invited to speak at Texas A&M by an unaffiliated, it was by a student, not a group, but he was invited to come and address Texas A&M. And it engendered massive protests. And thankfully, we were glad to see Texas A&M did resist calls from hundreds or thousands of people to disinvite Richard Spencer. And he did manage to speak there in front of 400 people. But the counter protest, somebody set up a counter event, which we think is a fine thing to do. That drew 7,000 attendees as opposed to the 400 Richard Spencer got. Unfortunately, I think they got burned by it. They got burned by the political ramifications of having this guy on campus, and they've now revised their policies so that unaffiliated members of the public and even students aren't allowed to invite speakers on campus, but only recognize student organizations. Obviously, this is a concern for FIRE, and that's something we're trying to work with Texas A&M to talk about, to see if we can fix that. Oh, and this is the famous sort of sequence of events, and I think this is really what started to contribute to what we saw at Berkeley and then later at Middlebury, and I think what we sort of got started with the attacks on Trump supporters during the election cycle. This is Richard Spencer getting punched, and this is 3 stills from a video that was on YouTube and went very viral. And if you see references to punching Nazis or whatever, if you see that increase, that's from this. Basically, this guy got punched. You can see he's in front of a sign that says "White Lives Matter." He was just out there talking about his views. Somebody ran up and sucker punched him, and that was hailed by a lot of people as a heroic, great thing to do. And so now there's a lot of talk that that's the sort of way we should treat people with his kind of views. Which brings us to Milo Yiannopoulos. Milo Yiannopoulos is a provocateur, I think it's safe to say. He's known mainly for his controversial views on race and feminism and for being banned by Twitter, although that's not that much of an accomplishment anymore. They'll ban just about anybody. And in 2016, he actually had the dubious distinction of being the recipient of the most campus disinvitation attempts. FIRE actually has a database. You can go to our website, thefire.org, and search for our disinvitation database. And when we get a report that somebody's attempted to be disinvited or successfully been disinvited, we add that to the database. I think there's upwards of 400 entries in there now. And so out of the 43 we found in 2016, which was itself a record number, 11 were about that guy. And violence has erupted twice at speeches on campus where he was supposed to speak. In late January at UC Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, a woman shot a protester who was allegedly acting aggressively towards her husband, who was a Milo fan. And then actually at the University of Washington, another person was shot in kind of a fracas, or whatever you'd call it, over sort of a really odd confluence of events that involved the person being shot being an anti-fascist skinhead who had sort of like swastikas tattooed on him but with X's through him, and somebody thought he was an actual Nazi. It was all very confusing, and he got shot. Thankfully, nobody died, but obviously it was an extremely confused situation. That was out on the streets of Seattle, but again, that was because Milo Yiannopoulos had come to town, or that was the occasion for it anyway. And then, of course, you probably saw Berkeley, as almost everybody did. There were a lot of protests beginning the day at Berkeley as it got darker. Obviously, you can see things got a little more violent. A mix of students and non-students, a lot of them wearing black clothing and black masks. Some people call this the Black Bloc, is the name of it, B-L-A-C-K, B-L-O-C, of anarchists or anti-fascists or whatever you want to call it. It's often sort of a mix. Went onto Berkeley's campus and caused the damage. You can see the fire. They pushed over a light and set it on. It set on fire. It was full of gasoline. They trashed the Amazon store very specifically. I guess they didn't like Amazon Prime or something, but they were very upset about Amazon. That was, I think it was just more convenient than anything else. You can see them marching there, and then unfortunately, and not that all of this isn't pretty unfortunate, but a number of people were also physically attacked at this protest. I talked to 2 or 3 of them on the phone, actually, and it's it's really painful in some ways to hear. Man and woman, husband and wife, went to see the speech. The husband got knocked out and didn't really remember what a lot was happening, although somebody did tweet a picture of him staggering, staggering on the ground. They were all pepper sprayed, which was interesting to hear how painful that is and what pepper spray does to you. And the police, by all reports, and Berkeley is supposedly investigating this, the police, there were probably about 100 of them, is what I hear, inside this building, which was the center of the protest, but nobody came outside the building. And in fact, these students told me that one of them got up to the building and tried to get in after being pepper sprayed and sort of punched and beaten. Somebody got hit in the head with a flagpole, and the police wouldn't let them in. So it was really it was very extremely grim situation. Milo Yiannopoulos had been put at this point. He wasn't able to speak at all. He was put in a bulletproof vest and hustled out sort of a parking garage going the other way. And so this was a real success in the sense that for the protesters slash rioters, in that they did manage to keep Yiannopoulos from speaking at all. One of the main things that we hear when it comes to Yiannopoulos and other folks with controversial views is that they are examples of hate speech. And you're hearing hate speech a lot nowadays, often sort of coupled with talk about fake news, hate speech, and all of these sorts of things that there's this real press to get social media companies, more traditional media companies, and governments to try to take care of. In fact, I just saw that Germany is going to try to get an authority in to decide what's fake news and what's not. And so I want to talk a little bit about the attempts that we've seen over the years, because this isn't new. There's nothing new about trying to tell people they can't say things. Hate speech, whatever that is, defined however they define it, has been illegal in a lot of parts of the world for a long time. So it's not like we're running an experiment. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. So I wanted to take you through a couple of places that do monitor hate speech and censor it, because these are the countries you'll hear often. You'll say, well, Canada, for instance, is not a totalitarian dictatorship. What's it like, for hate speech there? Here's Canada's hate speech law, or one of them. Some of their provinces have it too. Everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or an offense punishable on summary conviction. And so I've just put this isn't from Canada, that's from the Trump protests. But you can see, I think they're probably communicating statements in a public place that incite hatred against the identifiable group of Trump voters. In Canada, technically, that could be used as hate speech. Is it likely to lead to a breach of the peace? Well, we did see lots of that at Trump's inauguration. So that's the sort of thing that in Canada, you could be swept up and imprisoned for 2 years for holding up that sign in public. In the United Kingdom, a person is guilty of an offense if, with intent to cause a person harassment, alarm, or distress, he uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behavior, or displays any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, thereby causing that or another person, so not even necessarily the person you were aiming it at, harassment, alarm, or distress. And there's a similar provision that says stirring up religious hatred. And so I include this little clip from the BBC. An atheist was found guilty by a jury of leaving cartoons at the Liverpool airport that made fun of religious figures. So again, he left them basically in the Interfaith Chapel. They tracked him down, and in front of a British jury, guilty as charged. In Germany, some hate speech laws, they've criminalized insulting communities of faith, including Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. That's punishable up to 3 years of imprisonment. Also illegal is incitement to class warfare or acts of violence towards other social classes. Prohibited is also prohibited. And over 15 years, they've prosecuted 200 people for hate speech. Now, this is kind of a trick, because that's actually the law of Weimar Germany. That was the hate speech law of Weimar Germany. And here's a picture of a guy who fell afoul of the restrictions in Germany. His name is Adolf Hitler. You may have heard of him. And this poster here says, he alone of 2 billion people on earth may not speak in Germany. And that actually became a propaganda victory for the Nazis. It wasn't just Hitler, who was jailed several times. The people who ran the Daily Stormer, some of the Nazi propaganda organs were repeatedly jailed during the Weimar Republic for it. And so one of the arguments we hear a lot is, well, if only, the Nazis used free speech to take over. No, they didn't. The Weimar Republic was willing to put these guys in jail, and they did it over and over again. And yet, was it effective? No. Why do we think it'll be effective now? Well, maybe we're smarter now, maybe we're not. But that's the current thinking. That's what you're going to hear, is that, oh, well, in Germany, nobody went after these guys for what they said, and that worked everybody up. Well, that's not true. That's factually incorrect. France, noted hate monger Bob Dylan fell afoul of France's hate speech law. This is a current one, banning public or private insult, defamation, or incitement to discrimination, to hatred, or violence against a person or group for belonging or not belonging in fact or in fancy to an ethnicity, basically a whole bunch of different things. And so he had talked about, this is a really interesting one. He had said, he was talking about ethnic sort of ferment in Europe and in other places, and he said something along the lines of like a Serb can sort of smell a Croatian, and a Croatian can smell a Serb, and it always causes problems. And again, it's Bob Dylan. I don't know how strong his feelings are on the Serbian and Croatian relations and that sort of thing, but he was making the point that people are very sensitive towards ethnicity, which I think is sort of an obvious point in many ways, but he put it that way, and that brought him to be investigated in France for the racist comments. We also saw Brigitte Bardot get in trouble for saying insulting things about Islam, etc. In fact, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, France imprisoned, or they I don't know if they imprisoned more than 70 people, but they prosecuted more than 70 people for hate speech on Twitter, considering basically hate speech being speech, just a tweet sort of in favor of, or that seems sympathetic of, the attackers. And so I kind of wanted to, just sort of show, because so many people are so convinced and they are so morally certain that we can figure out what is hate speech and what isn't, which I would submit to you, you can't. A wag on the internet put together a quiz that you can take called Berkeley or Hitler. Now, the way this quiz works is after Milo Yiannopoulos was violently prevented from speaking at Berkeley, the Daily Cal, which is Berkeley's paper, ran 5 different editorials, all of them justifying what happened here. And so somebody put together some quotes from Hitler versus quotes from these editorials, and the idea is to see if you can tell which one this is. So, you can do a show of hands or whatever, but the first one, is our right to struggle for our own self-preservation based on reality, or is it merely a subjective thing? Is that Berkeley? Who thinks it's Berkeley? Who thinks it's Hitler? Yeah, it's Hitler. It's from Mein Kampf on the struggle against Jewish Marxism. How about this one? Our shields are raised against you. No one will protect us. We will protect ourselves. How about that? Berkeley or Hitler? Star Trek. How about Hitler? Any Hitler voters? That one is Berkeley. That's from The Black Bloc Did What Campus Should Have, an article saying that the campus themselves should have risen up and attacked Milo's supporters and Milo himself violently. How about this one? Those who have no understanding of the political world around them have no right to criticize or complain. Who thinks that's Berkeley? How about Hitler? That's Hitler. Couple more. I don't want to belabor it too much, but how about this? We have to put a stop to the idea it's part of everybody's civil rights to say whatever they please. Who thinks that's Berkeley? Who thinks that's Hitler? Well, I guess we'll never know. Yep, it's Hitler. Yeah. Interesting, huh? How about enjoy your ability to be complacent while it lasts? Berkeley? Hitler? That one is Berkeley. That one's Berkeley. And finally, this is violence. If I know that you're planning to attack me, I'll do all I can to throw the first punch. Who thinks that's Berkeley? Who thinks that's Hitler? Berkeley. Now, there's no shame in getting anything wrong or really glory in getting anything right there, because the fact is they're not distinguishable by a reasonable person. And when you are, the folks who are so convinced that we can determine what hate speech is and what hate speech isn't, need to wrestle with the fact that you can't really tell. I mean, people of common intelligence and people of extraordinary intelligence, they can't tell which ones these are. Yes, context can give you a clue, etc. But the fact is, there is no way to ever come to a conclusion on this. The way that, well, I'll talk a little bit about how it's done in other countries. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Charles Murray, who Donna talked about. He is famous for the books The Bell Curve, which is probably his most famous, Losing Ground and Coming Apart. And he's frequently invited to college to speak about the latter two books, which he was trying to do actually in the case of Middlebury. He was talking about classism. He is often dogged by protest about the bell curve, which was sort of a groundbreaking book that argues that differences in IQ could lead to dramatic differences in outcomes with regard to academic achievement, poverty, and crime, and that those are outcomes that are more than some of the other things that we say. I know I'm not doing him total justice, and the bell curve actually starts with about a chapter or two of denying that he has any sort of racist or eugenic intentions, and that's not something I read into Murray, but nevertheless a lot of people do. This has caused many people to label him a white supremacist and an advocate for eugenics. He disputes both of those claims. This was the scene, or one of the scenes, at Middlebury, where in March he came to talk about coming apart, like I said, the book about classism and the partisan gap that's increasing in America. And before his appearance, a number of professors got together and they decried Murray and his work in the bell curve, even though a number of the people who actually signed on to this letter admitted they had never actually read the book, but they decried it anyway. When he showed up on campus, he ended up with more protesters than attendees in his lecture hall. He couldn't speak over the crowd who were yelling, "Racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away." Middlebury had an inkling that something like this might happen, and they moved him to a already prepared other room where he then addressed this room over Skype. So he was in another room with his host, Professor Allison Stanger, who was there to engage him in questioning and who didn't agree with his findings. So he was able to finish his talk that way after he got sort of booed off the stage. Then they headed out to the car to go to dinner together. That was when he and Professor Stanger got attacked by a mob. They pulled a stop sign out of the ground and hurled it at his car. Somebody also grabbed Professor Stanger's hair and ended up, wrenching her neck, and she ended up in the hospital, where she was ultimately visited by Middlebury's president. And had to wear a neck brace for a while after that. Protesters were stomping on the car. They didn't allow it to leave until they were dispersed. They did eventually get to dinner. And then one of the administrators from Middlebury came running into the dinner and said they're on their way, and they decided at that point they actually had to leave town. I mean, they said, you know what, we got to get out of town. We can't be here anymore, and they took off. And in the wake of this, I mean, we saw lots of think pieces that were decrying the violence, but one of the really unfortunate things we saw was that a lot of them said, well, he shouldn't have been allowed to speak anyway. They knew this should have happened, or they should have known this was going to happen, or it's understandable that this happened. So Middlebury should never have allowed this guy to speak in the first place. And that's really enabling what in the First Amendment world is called the heckler's veto. That's the idea that violent hecklers have a veto over what you're saying. That is not a constitutional principle. In fact, the government is not allowed to create a heckler's veto. Middlebury is a private university. They're not the government. But at the same time, it sets a really bad precedent to allow violent people, the more violence, to cancel speeches like this, because behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated. And if you make it possible to shut down speeches through violence, you are going to get more violence. And I'm morally certain myself that what happened at Middlebury would not have happened had Berkeley not successfully shut down Yiannopoulos. It really is, those are both very low cost ways to get your political point across. So far as fire knows, nobody's actually been punished for either of those yet. We're looking into it, but I mean, there are people with injuries, obviously $100,000 in property damage at Berkeley. Berkeley only arrested 4 people. I don't know if Middlebury did that either, but so far we don't know of any consequences happening. That doesn't mean they didn't, but we don't, they certainly haven't made it public. This is just, and I don't want to go over time too much, but I just want to talk a little bit about, the paradox of these speech codes. And I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of people aren't willing to actually follow this logical tree through to the end. And if you see an error in it, please let me know. But it used to be that speech restrictions were based on morality, like you would have the Comstock laws or the laws about sending obscene things in the mail, that sort of thing. The idea that you have to protect people from bad ideas that will corrupt their minds. Nowadays, you almost never see that. It's always justified by the idea of protecting less powerful people in a society, at least in Western societies. What that necessitates, somebody's got to decide what's bad and what's a legitimate political disagreement. So somebody's got to play Berkeley or Hitler, and they have to get it right. And that person or entity, because we live in a democracy, will be selected through some kind of political process, whether or not they are voted on, whether or not they're appointed by democratically elected officials, et cetera. The nature of politics is politics is war by other means, right? Just like diplomacy. The nature of politics is a contest, and you win by having more political power than your opponents. And so, therefore, you inevitably get to the point where the people who make and administer the regulations on speech laws will be the people with the most power, because why would the other people, be empowered to do that? Except that the people in power were purportedly the problem in the first place. If you go to the top, we have to protect the less powerful members of society. Now we've put the people who demonstrably have political power in charge of deciding what can be said and what can't. So now they have even more power, the power to silence their opponents on top of that. And then finally, where do we go from here? I wish I had a great definitive answer to this question, but I will say violent mob censorship does seem to be on the rise. And I think it coincides with the erosion of the value of free speech in the public eye. And what we see a lot now, and what you'll see if you talk to or listen to a lot of what these protesters say, is that, especially with regard to Milo Yiannopoulos, they'll say his speech is violence. It's violence against us. I know he's stirring up hatred, and that will result in violence against me, and therefore the speech itself is violence. Well, if speech is violence, it makes all the sense in the world to fight back with violence. You've already made that equivalent. So why would you hesitate to use physical violence if you're saying that speech is the same thing? There's no reason you would hesitate. Like I said, the people responsible for this stuff don't seem to get disciplined or prosecuted. Again, that may change, but right now that seems to be the pattern. And we can hope, and actually we did think this would happen after Berkeley, that at some point you're going to cross a line and people will come to their senses. That is yet to happen. And just wanted to close with an assurance that FIRE is going to do what we can to fight against shutting down of speech, regardless of whether it's through those policies or students through silencing opponents through violence, or the government trying to take steps to regulate speech. And that's it. If you want to know more about FIRE, please visit us at thefire.org. Thank you.